If you've been a regular viewer of this channel for a while now, then you might remember that almost a year ago, we ran into an interesting situation. As we were putting the final touches on one of our long-form videos, we came across a news report that had just been released. That news report was covering an announcement from the Illinois Innocence Project. It turned out that after more than 20 years, the exact story we were working on, the Karyn Slover case, was being reopened. Not only that, but the organization claimed that they had evidence showing that the people that had been convicted all those years ago were actually innocent. At the time, this was pretty frustrating. We didn't want to scrap the video entirely, but we also knew that we couldn't release it in its current form until we had more information, which is what we told you at the time. Now, since all of this happened in February of 2024, a bunch of you have been reaching out to us and asking when we were finally going to give you an update on the situation. The truth is, we naively thought that this whole thing would have come to a resolution by now, but we've been quietly following developments behind the scenes for months, and that doesn't seem to be the case. So, here's what we've decided to do. In the first part of today's video, we're going to tell you this story more or less as we had originally planned to, and the way that things still technically stand at the time of this recording. However, we're going to follow that up immediately by digging into some of the latest claims being made by the Innocence Project and the information that has been released so far. Unfortunately, as you'll see, we still don't have all of the answers here, and this is very much an ongoing situation. But even so, there's a lot to dig into. That means this is going to be a long one, so apologies for that. But as always, we hope you find it interesting and informative. Just before 10 p.m. on September 27, 1996, dispatchers with Illinois' Piatt County Sheriff's Office began receiving calls about a strange situation on a local highway. A number of drivers who had been traveling down Interstate 72 reported seeing what appeared to be an abandoned vehicle, which had been left along the shoulder of the road about a mile and a half east of the community of Whiteheath, near the Illinois 10 exit. It was hard to tell in the dark, but bizarrely, the caller said, it didn't look like anyone was around. When officers arrived at the spot, they quickly found the vehicle in question, a black four-door 1992 Pontiac Bonneville. They also realized that the scene was even more unsettling than originally described. Not only had the car's lights been left on, its engine was still running and the driver's side door was wide open. Despite this, there was no sign of the driver anywhere. It was as if the person behind the wheel had simply stepped outside for a brief moment and then vanished into thin air. The inside of the car told a similar story. Several personal items were found scattered around, mostly on the front passenger seat and the floor. This included some loose change, a bag and disposable cup from a fast food restaurant, a half-eaten candy bar, and a woman's purse, which was found open. However, there were no obvious signs of a struggle. After running the vehicle's plates, officers discovered that the Pontiac was registered to a man from the nearby city of Decatur named David Swan. They contacted David, hoping he could shed some light on the eerie situation. Unfortunately, things would only get stranger from here. David told police that he definitely wasn't the one who was driving the Pontiac that evening. In fact, he hadn't used the vehicle in several days. He had loaned it temporarily to his girlfriend, 23-year-old Karyn Slover. Disturbingly, David said he didn't know where she was either. One thing was for sure, though. There was no reason he could think of why Karyn would have left his car like this at the side of the highway. Piatt County police were still searching the vehicle when David arrived at the scene a short time later. He had rushed over to try and provide whatever additional information that he could. David explained that in addition to dating, he and Karyn were both employees at a local newspaper, the Decatur Herald and Review. This is where they had met. She worked as an advertising sales consultant, while he worked as a district sales manager in the circulation department. This is also the last place David said that he had seen Karyn. They had both been at the office together earlier that afternoon. When asked about why Karyn had been driving his Pontiac, David said that it was because she had recently been having trouble with the brakes on her own vehicle. As a result, he had let her borrow the car until she had a chance to take hers in for servicing. Needless to say, the way that police had found the Pontiac was troubling enough on its own. But by the time they spoke with David in person, they had discovered further alarming signs that they could be dealing with a potential crime. In particular, the fact that Karyn Slover's purse was empty. Sure enough, when asked to have a look at the vehicle, David noticed a couple of additional things. For starters, there was no sign of Karyn's cell phone, a Nokia 100. He said that he had called the phone quite a few times after police had reached out to him, but none of those calls had been answered. The second thing David apparently zeroed in on was something that police had also taken note of. On the driver's side floor of the car, there were a bunch of what appeared to be small black stones. These would turn out to be little pieces of coal ash, otherwise known as cinders. For those unfamiliar, cinders are used in road construction, sometimes as a base material before asphalt is put on top, but more often as a cheap form of surfacing for unpaved roads or parking lots, specifically to provide traction for vehicles. In this case, the presence of cinders was interesting for two reasons. Interstate 72 was a concrete highway, meaning that the cinders couldn't have come from there. Secondly, David said that he had cleaned his car before lending it to Karyn, suggesting that these must have been left on the floor very recently. After finishing their conversation with David, police continued their search of the scene and the surrounding area. In the meantime, they also began reaching out to others who knew the 23-year-old to see if they had any idea of her whereabouts. Among the first people officers spoke with were some of Karyn's co-workers at the Decatur Herald and Review, since David had mentioned that she had definitely been there earlier that day. The colleagues confirmed that Karyn had left the newspaper's offices on East William Street at 5:05 p.m. They also said that based on conversations they had with her, they had a rough idea of where she was headed after work. Like every weekday, she was supposed to go to pick up her 3-year-old son Colton from her ex-husband's parents' house. After that, she planned to go dress shopping because she had a wedding to attend the next day. Understandably, authorities' next calls were to Karyn's former in-laws, Michael and Jeanette Slover, as well as to her ex-husband, Michael Slover Jr. The family members claimed that they were just about to reach out to police themselves, and that they were also now extremely worried about Karyn. According to them, she had never shown up that afternoon to pick up Colton. It wasn't a far trip either. The Slovers lived in Mount Zion, which was about a 10-mile drive southeast of Karyn's office. It only should have taken her about 20 minutes to get there after leaving work. This was nowhere near where the abandoned vehicle had been found. Whiteheath is about 30 miles northeast of Decatur, so almost the complete opposite direction. Much like David, the Slovers said that they had repeatedly attempted to call Karyn after realizing that she was missing. However, they had been unsuccessful. The more that investigators spoke with those close to Karyn, the more that they were convinced that something was seriously wrong. Friends, family, and coworkers all agreed that it was completely unlike the 23-year-old to suddenly take off. They also agreed that if Karyn had planned to go somewhere, there was no way that she would have left her son behind. Colton was the absolute center of her world. Every evening, she rushed out of work to make sure she could spend as much time with him as possible. With police reaching out to so many of Karyn's loved ones for information, news of her disappearance began to travel fast. Wanting to help in any way they could, many, especially her co-workers at the newspaper, began printing missing persons flyers. By noon the following day, hundreds of these flyers had already been handed out and put up all around Decatur and in neighboring areas. In addition to this massive effort, authorities conducted their own ground searches using police dogs to increase their chances of success. Unfortunately, nothing of interest was found in the area around Karyn's vehicle. Detectives followed up on several potential sightings of the 23-year-old by witnesses who said that they might have seen her near the Pontiac before it was found. However, these likewise failed to pan out. Rather than uncovering answers, it seemed that police were instead fielding a growing list of questions. What had happened to Karyn Slover during the 5-hour window between when she left for work and when her car was found abandoned at the side of the road? And why was the vehicle found so far off course from where she was supposed to be heading that evening? As the investigation blew past the 36-hour mark with no real updates, a sense of uneasiness and dread began building amongst everyone involved. Sadly, things were only about to get worse. It started when authorities received a deeply unsettling phone call. At around 3:30 p.m. on September 29th, so nearly 2 full days into the search effort, police in Moultrie County, Illinois were asked to come and check out a suspicious plastic bag that had been found floating in Lake Shelbyville. A couple who had been boating on the lake that afternoon had spotted the bag in the water just off the shoreline as they were beaching their boat at Finley Marina. When they went to retrieve it, they said that they immediately got a bad feeling. It didn't feel like an ordinary bag of garbage. It appeared to contain a single roundish object, one that was heavy for its size. Something about it just gave the couple the creeps. When officers arrived at the scene, they realized that the bag actually had another bag inside it, one that had been ominously duct-taped shut. It turned out that the couple had good reason to be apprehensive. When the bag was cut open, police were horrified to discover that it contained a human head. Almost immediately, the officers were hit with an awful realization. They knew that just 1 county over, there was an active search for a missing young woman. While the bag and its contents were sent off for analysis, police from Decatur and all over the surrounding area were brought in to conduct a massive search of Lake Shelbyville. This effort would last for more than a week and would involve the use of boats, divers, and ground teams in order to scour as much of the lake as possible. It wasn't long before more gruesome discoveries were made. Similar bags began to be pulled from both the water and the shoreline, each of which were filled with more human remains. Though not all of the remains could be found, it was enough for police to determine that they had all come from the same victim. Thanks to dental records, an identification was quickly made. Tragically, they had found Karyn Slover. The case had now gone from a missing persons investigation to a murder. When news of Karyn's death was announced the following day, no one could believe it. Yes, everyone had been desperately worried, but the truth was just so horrifying it didn't seem real. Especially heartbreaking was the idea that the 23-year-old's young son would now be forced to grow up without a mother who clearly loved him so much. The timing of the crime seemed particularly cruel for other reasons as well. It had happened right as Karyn was really starting to find her footing in life and seemed like she might be on the verge of achieving her dreams. As I previously mentioned, Karyn was recently divorced from her husband Michael Slover Jr. They had been married for about 3.5 years, with the divorce being finalized in May, just 4 months before her death. The whole situation had been extremely tough for Karyn, but she had managed to work through it. In her mind, everything had been worth it because the relationship had given her her son, Colton. While life as a single mother certainly had its challenges, it had also been a motivator for Karyn. She had always dreamed of being a model, but after her divorce, she started to pursue a career in the industry a lot more seriously. Within a short time, she had landed a couple of local gigs with the goal of eventually getting some bigger jobs. Tragically, just a week or two before she was killed, Karyn had found a potentially life-changing opportunity. She had gotten in contact with an agency that could help her find additional modeling work and really get her foot in the door. The 23-year-old had excitedly told her coworkers that if all went well, she was planning to move out of the state, either to California or Georgia. Not only was this a dream come true, it would allow her to provide a much better life for Colton. Sadly, now none of it would ever come to fruition. As loved ones were struggling to process the crushing loss, investigators were making several important discoveries, both back at Lake Shelbyville and with the analysis of the remains. In addition to identifying Karyn, the medical examiner had been able to determine her cause of death. Disturbingly, the 23-year-old mother had died from 7 gunshot wounds to the head from a .22 caliber weapon. One of the bullets had hit her in the forehead, while the other 6 were to the back of her skull. It seemed that whoever had carried this out had done so with an extreme amount of anger. The way that Karyn had been disposed of displayed a similar level of brutality. Marks on her recovered remains suggested that her body had been cut into pieces with some kind of power tool before being placed into the bags. She had been fully clothed at the time that this had happened. Speaking of the bags, these also provided additional clues. Along with the remains, investigators found pieces of concrete and other rocks that they believed had been used in an attempt to weigh them down. Some of these quickly caught their attention. Among the debris were more cinders, ones that looked identical to those that had been found on the driver's side floor of the abandoned Pontiac Bonneville. On top of this, detectives noticed that quite a few of the bags had actually split open by the time they were found. They theorized that perhaps this was because they had been thrown into the water from a little ways up. There was one spot in particular that came to mind: the nearby Findlay Bridge that ran right across Lake Shelbyville, close to the marina where Karyn's remains had initially been found. The bridge would have made an ideal dumping spot. The perpetrator could have driven their car to the middle, during which time they would have had about a half-mile of visibility of any potential witnesses in either direction. Sure enough, when investigators searched the bridge, they found a small spot of blood that would later come back as a match to Karyn Slover. As promising as all of this was, many questions still remained. Chief among them, who had killed Karyn and why? Investigators weren't sure, but they could think of at least one obvious place to start looking. Once the search for Karyn Slover changed from a missing persons investigation to a murder investigation, the case was handed over to the Illinois State Police. They began by re-interviewing everyone who had been questioned in connection with the initial disappearance, with special attention paid to those closest to the 23-year-old. The reason was twofold. Not only could these people offer the most insight into Karyn's life, based on the evidence collected so far, authorities were confident that she knew her killer. With this in mind, it wasn't long before they settled on their first suspect: Karyn's ex-husband, 26-year-old Michael Slover Jr. Friends of Karyn's told detectives that the relationship between Karyn and Michael had not been a good one. He was emotionally and physically abusive, and several people claimed that they had witnessed this behavior directly, well before they were even married. When police looked Michael up, they realized he had previous run-ins with law enforcement, albeit these were apparently for minor incidents. Upon sitting down with Michael, police asked him about his movements on the night of the disappearance, particularly during that 5-hour time frame between when Karyn left work and when the abandoned car was found. Michael stated that he had been working pretty much the whole afternoon and night. He had a few different jobs, and his schedule had actually been pretty packed that evening. The 26-year-old said that he spent most of the day at the local Cub Foods grocery store where he worked as a security guard. He hadn't finished his shift until about 6 p.m., roughly an hour after Karyn had already left her office. After leaving the grocery store, Michael said he stopped at a home about 2 miles away where he gave a private karate lesson to one of his students, something he did on the side. The lesson finished up just before 7 p.m., at which point he drove home for a quick shower. He didn't spend long there before heading back out again to his last job, working as a bouncer at a local bar called Ronnie's Lounge. The 26-year-old said that he was at the bar until at least 2 a.m. When investigators looked into Michael's alibi, they discovered that every part of it checked out. It turned out that he even had another witness during the gap between the karate lesson and his arrival at the bar. He had spotted a minor accident on the way home and stopped to talk with a police officer there after realizing that he recognized him. In short, there was no way that Michael could have committed the murder. This wasn't necessarily a problem for investigators, though, because by this time they already had a second suspect in mind: Karyn's boyfriend, David Swan. Now, initially, David had been seen purely as a witness. When he first spoke to police, he was extremely helpful and seemed genuinely brokenhearted. However, detectives were starting to wonder if maybe he was being a little too helpful, almost like he was trying to insert himself into the investigation to look less suspicious. They also noticed that he seemed to be giving a lot of televised interviews to the media where he appeared incredibly emotional. This struck investigators as odd, especially when they asked around and learned that David and Karyn had only been dating for a few weeks. From the way that David had described things during their conversations, they had gotten the impression that the relationship was a lot more serious. He had suggested that him and Karyn were in love and were likely to get married. In fact, police later found out that a card that David held up during a particularly emotional interview on TV that he claimed had been given to him by Karyn was actually one she had given to one of her previous boyfriends. When detectives looked deeper into David's background, they were even more troubled by what they found. He had previously been arrested for assault and for impersonating a law enforcement officer. The biggest red flag, though, came when authorities spoke to some of David's neighbors. They described a very unsettling incident in which he had hung a deer carcass in the corner of an empty swimming pool and had proceeded to butcher it with a chainsaw. Investigators couldn't help but see the overlap between this and the grisly way that Karyn Slover's remains had been disposed of. But if David was responsible for the heinous crime, what had been his motive? Authorities thought they might have an idea when they remembered what friends and coworkers had told them about the good news Karyn had received about her modeling career. The 23-year-old had been straightforward about the fact that she would likely be moving if the opportunity worked out. Perhaps, they theorized, David had killed her after becoming angry at the prospect of being left behind. With that, David Swan was brought in for another interview. During this new conversation, detectives pressed David for more detailed information concerning his whereabouts around the time of Karyn's disappearance. He explained that after work that day, he went to a rehearsal for his friend's wedding, which was followed by a rehearsal dinner at a local restaurant called Tater's Family Grill. He said there were dozens of people that could confirm his attendance. When investigators went to confirm David's alibi, however, they discovered that this wasn't 100% true. Yes, he had attended the two events that evening, but there had been a roughly 1-hour gap at the beginning of the dinner when David wasn't there. This had been very noticeable because David was in the wedding party, and it actually delayed things because no one could figure out where he was. After this, detectives were more suspicious than ever of David. They confronted him about the discrepancy in his alibi and also obtained a search warrant for his home. A thorough search of the property was conducted, with particular attention paid to a shed in the backyard. To their surprise, though, nothing of note was found either inside or outside the residence. Investigators discovered why when David happened to remember an incredibly important detail. He had gone to an ATM machine during the period of time in his story that was unaccounted for. Police obtained the surveillance video from the machine, and sure enough, there was David. As a somewhat amusing side note, according to a source we came across, authorities were able to identify David in the video, in part because of a shirt that he was wearing, one that detectives remembered as being incredibly ugly. Ugly shirt or not, though, it seemed that David was telling the truth. After this, investigators moved on to one other previous boyfriend of Karyn's. However, he was quickly ruled out too. At this point, authorities were at a dead end. The obvious suspects were really the only suspects they had in the case, and now all of them had pretty well been eliminated. Despite this, detectives were convinced they were missing something. They decided they had to go back to the beginning if they were going to find the answers they were looking for. After essentially deciding to circle back to the start of the investigation, Illinois State Police began poring over everything they had collected so far. When they did, they kept coming back to one fundamental fact of the case. They knew that on the afternoon that Karyn Slover disappeared, she had been headed to pick up her son. Now, obviously, prior to this, authorities had suspected Karyn's ex-husband could be involved, but when Michael Slover Jr.'s alibi proved to be ironclad, this theory had more or less collapsed. That being said, there was another potential angle to this, one that detectives now realized they hadn't properly explored. That's when they began to ask more serious questions about Karyn's relationship with the rest of the Slover family, particularly with her former in-laws, Jeanette and Michael Sr. Those close to Karyn said that, much like her relationship with her ex-husband, the situation with his family was incredibly toxic. This was especially true with Jeanette, who friends claimed absolutely despised her. Now, there was no shortage of things that Jeanette criticized Karyn for, but interestingly, there was one topic that came up over and over again. Jeanette made it clear to anyone who would listen that she thought that her former daughter-in-law was an unfit mother. She also made it clear that she thought she would do a much better job of raising Colton. Karyn's friends went on to say that though she did everything possible to minimize her interactions with the Slovers following her divorce, the custody arrangement with her son made this nearly impossible. She had to see them every weekday because the Slovers looked after Colton while she was at work. To be clear, this was not some arrangement of convenience to save on daycare costs or something. Karyn actively did not want this. However, it was something Jeanette had pushed for during the divorce proceedings. She had strong-armed her son into refusing to sign any agreement with Karyn until it was mandated that she would get to babysit her grandson until he started school. According to Karyn's loved ones, this was at least as much about spending time with Colton as it was making Karyn's life a living hell. They explained that Jeanette took full advantage of the power this afforded her and would make it as uncomfortable and difficult for the young mother as possible every single night she came to pick up her son. Oftentimes, Karyn would have to physically rip Colton from Jeanette's arms because she refused to let him go, and Karyn almost always left the house in tears. The torment wasn't even confined to weekdays. One of Karyn's friends told police that Jeanette would show up unannounced at her home on weekends to interrupt their time together and to harass her. There were two accounts that authorities heard that were far and away the most troubling. The first was from a co-worker of Jeanette Slover's, who recalled something she said shortly after the birth of her grandson. The colleague said that Jeanette told them she felt so attached to Colton that she felt like he was actually her son. The second story was from David Swan, who recounted an incredibly chilling statement Jeanette had made on one of the days where Colton had to be physically ripped from her arms so that he and Karyn could go home. Jeanette said, quote, "Colton, don't worry. One day you'll be all mine." The more detectives looked into the Slovers, the more suspicious details they seemed to find. For starters, despite Michael Jr.'s ironclad alibi, neither Jeanette nor Michael Sr. could provide a verified accounting of their whereabouts during that crucial 5-hour time frame on the night of Karyn's disappearance. On top of this, phone records revealed that there were an abnormally large volume of calls between the Slover home in Mount Zion and the grocery store where Michael Jr. worked on the day of the crime. Equally as interesting was who the Slovers had not called. Despite their initial claims that they had been worried about Karyn and tried to contact her, the record showed that they had never actually phoned her. Things heated up further when authorities obtained a warrant to search the used car lot that the Slover family owned, called Miracle Motors. The business was located about 1.5 miles away from the family's residence, just off of Illinois State Route 121. Detectives became interested in the location after hearing from nearby residents who said they witnessed unusual activity there following Karyn's disappearance. For years, neighbors said that the local municipality had been sending the Slovers notices about their failure to keep the car lot clean. They had ignored all of them right up until Karyn went missing. Suddenly, for days afterwards, they had been cutting weeds, moving things in the lot, and just generally cleaning the place thoroughly. Most noteworthy of all, it appeared they had also been burning large amounts of the materials they were cleaning up. Almost as soon as investigators arrived at Miracle Motors, they noticed something else that jumped out to them. The car lot's base was made out of cinders, and there were chunks of concrete scattered in various places. At this point, detectives felt they had a solid theory. The Slovers had organized the murder together and had meticulously planned it so that Michael Jr. had an alibi because they knew police would focus on him first. The motive was also clear. The Slover family knew that if Karyn got her new modeling job, she would take Colton with her, and they couldn't stand that, especially not Jeanette. It seemed like only a matter of time before the case would be closed. But things were about to hit a major roadblock. Despite a detailed search of Miracle Motors, investigators couldn't find any hard evidence that proved the Slovers were involved. Yes, there was the cinders and the concrete, and the phone records showed that the family had lied, but this was not enough on its own to charge them. It wasn't long after this that the case went cold. Understandably, this only amplified the grief of Karyn's loved ones, who were already struggling to come to terms with what had happened. Perhaps the best example of this is an open letter written by Karyn's mother, Donna Hearn, which had been published a couple of months earlier during another period of stagnation in the investigation. The letter was a heartbreaking plea to Karyn's killer, one in which she simply begged to know why her daughter had been taken away from her. The letter read in part, quote, "I miss Karyn more than you'll ever know. Colton misses his mommy. He understands that she's gone. He doesn't understand that it's forever, but I do. I don't know who you are, but I pray you'll help me understand. Maybe you have regrets. Maybe you don't have that much compassion. Perhaps you can't love and don't understand how much we loved Karyn in spite of her imperfections. Her father and I need to understand why she had to die. When her son gets older, I need something to tell him to help him understand. Please help us understand." Despite how utterly gut-wrenching all of this was for Karyn's loved ones, it was also a time when the community came together. Separate memorial and education funds were set up for Karyn and Colton, and someone else took the initiative to create a memory box for the young boy so he would know how much his mother loved him. A newspaper article written about this at the time reads, quote, "Friends, co-workers, and associates of Karyn Slover are asked to write down their feelings about his mother. Their letters will go into Colton's memory box, so when he is older, he can understand and appreciate the writings." Around this same time, Karyn's colleagues at the Decatur Herald and Review planted and dedicated a maple tree to her. Inscribed on a plaque next to it are the words, "She gave us many special memories." According to reports from the time, Karyn's parents and brothers attended this event and also reached out to the community on several occasions to thank them for their support. Of course, as touching as all of this was, it was no substitute for actual justice. But with nothing to prove their theory, investigators were stuck. That's when they decided to try something new. In early 1998, so more than a year after Karyn Slover's murder, her case was picked up by a special agent with the Illinois State Police named Michael Mannix. After poring over the case files and all of the information that had been collected, Mannix was convinced that the original investigative team was nearly there. He was also convinced that he could find the evidence he needed to put the Slover family away. In order to do that, though, he was going to need some help. That's when he contacted a man named Richard Monroe from Manitoba's Winnipeg Police. Monroe was a specialist in forensic geology, and he had actually pioneered techniques in the field for lifting fingerprints off of stone and concrete. The new techniques weren't what Mannix was interested in, though. Instead, he wanted Monroe to help him pay another visit to the Miracle Motors car lot. After obtaining the proper warrants, Mannix, Monroe, and a large team of investigators settled in for a second search of the lot. This one was to be far more thorough. Under Monroe's instruction, the team treated the car lot like an archaeological dig site. They took away buckets and buckets of earth, then meticulously worked through it with graduated sifters. If this sounds incredibly time-consuming, that's because it was. The process took months and appears to have been extremely tedious. In the eyes of detectives, though, it would all be worth it in the end. Amongst the countless buckets of dirt, gravel, and other debris, investigators finally found something. A metal button from a pair of buttonfly jeans, 2 jean rivets, and a cloth button from a women's blouse. All of these appeared to match the clothes that were found with Karyn Slover's remains. The cloth button especially was seen as a big discovery. When it was examined under a microscope, an expert determined that it was made of the same fibers and had the exact same weave pattern. To detectives, it proved that Karyn had made it to the Slover's car lot to pick up her son on the day of her murder. In January of 2000, all 3 members of the Slover family were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. All of them pleaded not guilty. When the case went to trial 2 years later, the Slover's defense team leaned into the fact that the entire case against them was circumstantial. They pointed out that no murder weapon had ever been recovered, no crime scene was officially established, and there were no direct witnesses to what had happened. Prosecutors were under no illusions about the fact that they were fighting an uphill battle. However, they pointed to the evidence that they had worked so hard to collect. The cinders, the concrete, the buttons, the rivets, they argued all of it added up to form an overwhelming case. They also presented numerous witnesses who attested to the hatred that the Slovers had for Karyn. They argued that on the day of the crime, Karyn had arrived at the Slover home in Mount Zion and had been told by one of the family members that Colton was at the car lot with one of his grandparents. As soon as Karyn arrived, she was ambushed, likely by Jeanette, who then shot and killed her. The grandparents then began disposing of the body, while Michael Jr. got to work establishing his alibi. By this time, authorities had also uncovered one more piece of evidence: several dog hairs that were stuck to the duct tape of one of the bags pulled from Lake Shelbyville. When the hair was compared to one taken from a black lab owned by the Slovers, an expert found it to have a number of common genetic markers that made it very likely they were a match. Apparently, this expert stopped short of saying it was definitely a match, though they were also prevented from conducting further testing because the Slovers reportedly had the dog in question euthanized once they found out police were pursuing this line of inquiry. The evidence proved to be convincing enough for a jury, because in May of 2002, Michael, Jeanette, and Michael Sr. were all convicted of first-degree murder. They were each sentenced to 60 years in prison, with the men receiving an extra 5 years apiece for concealment of a homicidal death. Michael Slover Sr. died in prison in June of 2022 from complications relating to heart disease. Michael Jr. was released on parole in March of 2024, while Jeanette Slover is due to be paroled sometime in 2028. So this is where our original video on the Karyn Slover case ended. Based on everything we researched at the time, it seemed like the story was pretty straightforward. And that's certainly how it's been presented over the last 20 or so years, especially in news coverage and in popular crime shows like Forensic Files. However, as I mentioned, there's a whole other side to this, one that is being argued by the Illinois Innocence Project. They have been working on the case since the mid-2000s and have now caused it to make its way back to the courts. I want to be clear, nothing has actually been overturned at this time. Instead, over the last few months, the Innocence Project has filed a bunch of motions, and in those motions, they have claimed to have found evidence showing that the Slovers were both wrongfully convicted and are actually innocent. So, why is the organization working to get the convictions thrown out, and what are their arguments? Well, based on all of the information we've been able to find, it seems that there are three broad categories: junk science, police mistakes and inaccuracies, and alternative suspects and potentially exculpatory evidence. Just before we dive into each of these, I want to say that I am not any kind of legal expert, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. All of this is based on my own research and understanding about what's happening, and quite frankly, I could just be wrong. This is also by no means meant to be exhaustive coverage of everything included in the motions that the Illinois Innocence Project has filed. They've submitted quite a few of these, each of which is dozens, if not hundreds of pages long. That being said, I'm going to do my best to summarize some of the major claims that are being made. I'll start with junk science, because this is probably the most relevant to things that we already went over in the video. So basically, the Innocence Project is arguing that a lot of the techniques that were used to enhance the credibility of the circumstantial evidence were just straight up garbage. They say they were based on bad science and used to project an air of certainty that was completely undeserved. The best example of this is probably the concrete and the cinders. At trial, prosecutors presented expert testimony stating that the concrete and cinders recovered from the bags and the abandoned car were found to be consistent with material found at the Slovers' business. This is actually a huge part of the Forensic Files episode on this case, where they explain that Richard Monroe, the forensic genealogist that was brought in to assist police, used high-energy radiation to do scans of the concrete evidence. Through these scans, he was able to determine that the concrete in the bags closely matched the chemical makeup of the concrete on the Slovers' property. While this appears to be true, the Innocence Project says that this doesn't actually prove anything. According to their own experts, the specific technique used only confirmed the presence of a bunch of minerals that were in the material, and these minerals were some of the most common that could be found in any concrete in Illinois. In other words, it could have come from anywhere. These same experts said that the situation was even worse for the cinders. Apparently, there is no reliable way to determine the origin of cinders with this level of specificity, especially with the small sample sizes that were used in the case. The Innocence Project also attacked the DNA testing done on the dog hair. This one isn't so much junk science, as animal DNA has been used successfully in court many times. However, they argue that the techniques used were outdated and that there were issues with how the testing was carried out. The gene buttons and rivets were another point of contention, and one that we'll talk more about in a second. But essentially, it's the same idea. The Innocence Project pointed out that the Slovers often burned old clothing and other items on their property, so the mere presence of gene rivets and buttons isn't that surprising. As for their resemblance to the clothing that Karyn was wearing at the time of her death, their experts argue there's no definitive way to prove they came from the same pair of jeans. Moving on to police mistakes and general inaccuracies, one of the biggest things the Illinois Innocence Project seems to be focusing on is something related to the Pontiac Bonneville that Karyn was driving on the night of her disappearance. Back during the trial, the Slovers' defense team presented witnesses who said that they had seen the vehicle driving around between 5:30 and 9:30 p.m., many miles away from where the Slovers' business was located. Obviously, this was right during the time when prosecutors argued Karyn was killed, so the defense was trying to establish doubt as to whether she was ever there. The witnesses claimed that they remembered the Pontiac because of its distinctive license plate and its tinted windows. The prosecution countered with testimony from David Swan, who stated that his vehicle did not have tinted windows. This seemed to undermine the credibility of the defense witnesses at the time, but the Innocence Project claims that they were later able to track down the car and its official records from General Motors. They say David Swan's Pontiac did, in fact, have lightly tinted windows. I mentioned before we would get back to the gene rivets and buttons, and that brings us to one of the more explosive suggestions made by the Illinois Innocence Project, namely that items recovered from the big geological dig at the Slovers' property could have been planted. Now, obviously, I'm not going to pretend that evidence has never been planted before, but this is a pretty serious accusation. And from what I've read, it doesn't seem like there's any proof that evidence actually was planted. More just that there was an opportunity. Basically, this claim rests on the idea that after the dirt was collected from the Slovers' car lot, the buckets were taken to a warehouse. Apparently, these buckets were left in the warehouse before being sifted for several weeks, and the place was not adequately secured. In other words, anyone could have gotten to them if they wanted to and put whatever in there. Again, this is not actually proof that the buckets were tampered with, but chain of custody for evidence is a serious thing in investigations like this. This stuff is supposed to be meticulously documented and properly stored, especially if you're going to rely on the contents as crucial evidence. The last broad category I'm going to talk about, alternative suspects and potentially exculpatory evidence, is probably the most interesting. And based on what I've read, it seems like if there was going to be a bombshell revelation, it'll come from here. In terms of alternative suspects, not a ton has been released, though I was able to find documents from a while ago that the Innocence Project had put together. They lay out a story that the jury apparently never heard during the Slovers' trial. Early in the morning on September 29th, 1996, so just hours before Karyn's remains were recovered from Lake Shelbyville, an officer in the village of Grant Park pulled over a Ford Mustang. There were 3 people inside the vehicle, and the car turned out to be stolen. As the officer was talking to the driver, a Suzuki that had been traveling with the Ford suddenly turned around a little ways down the road. The Suzuki then sped over the lane divider and hit the officer before smashing into his patrol car. While Grant Park is quite a ways away from where Karyn's murder happened, police later learned that the Ford Mustang had been stolen the day before Karyn was killed and was taken much closer to Decatur. Now, this doesn't sound like that big of a deal until you know that police apparently received tips in the days after Karyn's murder about 3 guys that were apparently bragging about stealing a car and killing a woman from the Decatur area. 2 of those men were the same 2 guys from the Suzuki. It gets even more interesting. According to the Innocence Project, despite their focus on small amounts of circumstantial evidence, One of the things prosecutors ignored at trial was blue wool fibers that were found both in the Pontiac Karyn was driving and in the bags with her remains. Nothing matching these blue fibers could apparently be located at either the Slovers' home or their business. However, based on pictures that were taken after the incident in Grant Park, we know that there was a blue flannel shirt in the back of the Suzuki. I should say, police did investigate these tips back in 1996 and also searched a motel room where the men in the Suzuki had been staying at the time. They didn't find anything related to the case and later concluded that the men were not involved. Still, it's pretty compelling stuff, and certainly something you would assume should have been brought up by the Slovers' defense team during their trial. The last thing I want to touch on is perhaps the most important of all, and that's new testing on physical evidence. And here it seems like there are two things the Illinois Innocence Project is focusing on: fingerprints and DNA. In terms of the fingerprints, they claim that there were several found inside of the Pontiac Karyn was driving that were never identified. There was also one print on Finley Bridge. If you recall, that's the spot where authorities theorized that the bags with the remains had been dumped into Lake Shelbyville. Interestingly, this single fingerprint, which has also never been identified, was located just 6 inches away from the blood spot that was matched to Karyn. The Illinois Innocence Project has stated that none of these fingerprints match the Slovers, though it's worth pointing out that it reportedly didn't match the two guys in the Suzuki either. As for the DNA, this is part of the ongoing battle that's happening in court right now. The Illinois Innocence Project claims that there are multiple unknown profiles on some of the duct tape found with Karyn's remains. They have stated that the DNA is not a match to either Jeanette or Michael Jr. It's unclear if Michael Sr.'s DNA was tested prior to his death, though. The Innocence Project has argued not only that more DNA testing needs to be carried out on evidence with modern technology, but that the unknown profiles police currently have need to be analyzed against the CODIS database, something which reportedly has not been done. A spokesperson for the organization said in an interview earlier this year, quote, "Not only are the Slovers excluded from this DNA evidence, but there are also unknown profiles that belong to the actual perpetrators, or, at the very least, would provide an investigative lead to the actual perpetrators." The Illinois State Police refused to pursue these leads. This DNA evidence totally vindicates the Slovers. Justice demands their convictions be overturned. Every day in which their convictions are upheld is another miscarriage of justice. At the current time, this is more or less where things stand. The Innocence Project continues to file motions attempting to force authorities to conduct more testing, while simultaneously arguing that what they have already found meets the standards to have the Slovers' convictions overturned. Conversely, one of the things that we really have no idea about so far is how the state plans to handle their side of all of this. We know that the Macon County State's Attorney's Office, which is handling the case, has asked for additional time to review the new evidence, but they have said very little beyond stating that they stand by the original investigation. The most recent court hearing reportedly took place on November 14th, 2024, though I couldn't find any additional news about it. In terms of my own thoughts on the matter, I'd say conflicted and confused are probably the best words to sum it up. Like many people at the time we originally dug into this case, I was 100% convinced that the Slovers were guilty. After reading all of this information presented by the Innocence Project, I'm not sure either way. Maybe that's the point, though. The system is supposed to be based on proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and insofar as that's the case, I think it's safe to say that I now have doubts. Now, given everything I told you in the first part of this video, it might be hard for you to even consider that the Slovers might be innocent, especially after hearing how they treated Karyn before her murder. And just for the record, I still think they totally could be guilty. But I will say this. There are a ton of nasty child custody and divorce disputes that happen every day, and very few of them end like this. To put it more bluntly, someone can be an asshole without being a murderer. Unfortunately, at this point, either way, justice has arguably not been done. If the Slovers are guilty, they've managed to needlessly prolong the grief and suffering of Karyn's loved ones for nearly 30 years. And if they're not, 3 innocent people have been wrongfully locked up for decades, one of whom died behind bars. All the while, the real killer or killers have been getting away with a truly horrifying crime. I'm not sure where the case will go from here, but I'm definitely open to doing more updates in the future if that's something you'd all be interested in hearing about. I'm also looking forward to reading your thoughts about all of this in the comments below. In the meantime, there's only one thing I know for sure. Karyn's family and friends deserve to be able to close the book on this awful chapter of their lives, once and for all. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.